Whoever says they celebrate failure and they don't mind failing, they're probably lying to you. I failed more times than I care to remember in my life, and every single time it sucked. I want to share with you some ideas on how you can reframe failure and see it in a different light. I think the beginning point here is that failure is really scary. Part of this is genetic programming. Our ancestors who did not fear failure became lunch for saber-toothed tigers. So it becomes, and they just didn't live long enough to pass their genes onto us. That genetic programming, that genetic conditioning against failure is then reinforced by society. So growing up, failure gets us into the principal's office. Failure means you get grounded. Failure means you get your allowance cut. Failure means you don't get into the college that you wanted, or you don't get the job that you wanted. But we're now told to celebrate failure. Fail fast, fail often, fail forward. That mantra is really popular in Silicon Valley. Business books instruct entrepreneurs not just to embrace failure, but to celebrate it. There are now funerals being held for failed startups in Silicon Valley, complete with bagpipes and DJs spinning records and alcohol flowing freely. There are conferences like FailCon dedicated to celebrating failure. I don't buy it. And I don't buy it for two reasons. Number one, when you celebrate something, you often don't learn from it. And number two, regardless of what Silicon Valley tells us, failure sucks. Whoever says they celebrate failure and they don't mind failing, they're probably lying to you. I failed more times than I care to remember in my life, and every single time it sucked. Because there's a value judgment attached to failure, right? Success is good and failure is bad. But it can be just as dangerous to demonize failure as it is to celebrate it. Because behind every canvas unpainted, every business unlaunched, every song unsung, every book unwritten is that looming fear of failure. And we tend to think of failure as a loss, right? You know, I lost a year of my life working on this project, or I spent 2 years writing a book that bombed. But failure is a loss only if you call it that. Another way to think about failure is as an investment. And failure can be the best teacher if you know how to approach it properly. And I'll give you some ideas on how to do that in just a few minutes here. Failure gives you data that you can't get anywhere else. So one of the failures in my life, one of the many failures in my life, I wrote a book, an academic book. That was my first book that came out maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And it was a failure. I think it sold less than 1,000 copies. And one of the big lessons that I learned from that failure was I tried to reach two very different audiences with the book. So I wanted to write a book that appealed to both academics and non-academics, and it ended up appealing to nobody. And I learned a really important lesson that I don't think I could have learned otherwise, of the importance of really drilling down on the audience that you're trying to reach. And of course, I had read about that concept in books before, but it really didn't hit home and really didn't resonate with me until I had that failure. Now, there are many things that went right with the book, and there's so much I learned from that process, but that particular lesson of you really need to pick your audience. You can't try to write a book that's going to appeal to everybody. It was such an important lesson for me to learn, and there is no way that I could have learned it at the level that I did without that particular failure. And if you're trying to achieve transformative things, you're not going to succeed on the first try. All breakthroughs are evolutionary, not revolutionary. I love this little sketch by Michelle Ryle about attempts and failures and successes. If you don't attempt anything, you're not going to fail, but success is also going to be not applicable. If you try a lot, you're also going to fail a lot. most of your ideas will fail. A few of them will be good. Some of them will succeed and will compensate in spades for the things that didn't work. And if you're operating with this experimentation mindset of placing little bets, then the failures won't be as big and the successes will compensate for the failures that actually do happen. Now, Einstein's first 7 proofs for E equals mc squared failed. Google has shut down 200 businesses. So they kill projects all the time. Thomas Edison famously said, "I haven't failed, I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." This is Sarah Blakely. She's the founder of Spanx, the apparel company. She went from selling fax machines door to door to becoming the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And she credits her success partially to a question that her father would ask her and her brother when they were growing up. What did you fail at recently and what did you learn from it? So contrast this question to the way that we normally interact with our students or our children, which is to focus on successes, to ask them about successes. In asking his children about what they failed at, Sarah's father gave them the breathing room to tackle interesting things and to fail from time to time. To him, failing to try was far more disappointing than failure itself. And I love the learning question here, which is what did you learn from it, right? And I think if I could change the fail fast, fail often mantra, I would change it to learn fast. The goal isn't to fail fast, because just because you're failing doesn't mean you're learning anything. The goal should be to learn. And there are 2 questions that I ask myself and that I would encourage you to ask as well when you fail. What went wrong with this failure? So for the academic book that I wrote that bombed, one of the things that went wrong was that I tried to appeal to everybody. But also, and this is a question that most businesses and most people don't ask, is what went right with this failure? It's possible to do some things right and still fail. And conversely, by the way, it's possible to do some things wrong and still succeed. These 2 questions I asked myself after both failures and successes. What went wrong with this failure? What went wrong with the success? And what went right with this failure? And what went right with the success? That has a way of taking the focus off of the outcome, so off of failure or success, and pivoting to inputs, to the things that actually matter. So there are a number of things that went right with that academic book that I mentioned, which is I actually learned how to tell really captivating stories. And that was one of the things in the book that I experimented with and that worked really well. And then I took what went right with that failure and I've applied it to the other books that I wrote since then. So Think Like a Rocket Scientist and then Awaken Your Genius, and brought in that storytelling aspect to convey principles through stories was really something I learned during the process of writing a book that ended up not doing well.